In the heart of the large Ghanaian village of Esomina, Kwame and Kojo grew up as brothers in all but blood. Their childhood was filled with endless adventures, climbing the towering baobab trees, swimming in the cool river that wound its way through the village, and listening to the elders recount tales of their ancestors by the fireside. They were inseparable, bound by dreams of one day leading their people to greatness. While Kojo was known for his wisdom and kindness, Kwame was admired for his strength and charm. The villagers often spoke of their friendship, believing that their unity would ensure prosperity for Esomina in the years to come. As they matured into young men, the elders began to notice Kojo's natural leadership qualities. He had a way of calming disputes and finding solutions where others saw only problems. The day came when the village council, after careful deliberation, announced that Kojo would be the next chief once the aging Chief Bafo stepped down. The village erupted in celebration, singing Kojo's praises, while Kwame forced himself to smile through the growing bitterness gnawing at his heart. That night, as the two friends sat under the vast starry sky, Kojo spoke excitedly about his plans for Esomina, unaware of the storm brewing within Kwame's soul. The seeds of envy had been sown, and though Kwame tried to silence them, they whispered dark thoughts that would soon take root. As days passed, the village remained abuzz with preparations for Kojo's eventual ascension to the chieftaincy. Everywhere Kwame turned, he saw Kojo's name woven into the fabric of daily life. Women sang his praises at the river, children mimicked his mannerisms, and even the elders spoke of his wisdom with reverence. Though Kwame smiled outwardly, a tempest raged within him. He could not understand why fate had chosen Kojo over him. Had they not shared the same dreams? Had he not worked just as hard, if not harder? These thoughts festered in his heart, turning the joy he once felt for his friend into quiet resentment. Late at night, Kwame sat alone outside his hut, staring into the flickering flames of his small fire. In his mind, he replayed every moment they had spent together, Kojo's laughter, his unwavering loyalty, his kind-hearted nature. It should have been Kwame's time to lead, yet here he was, watching his dream slip through his fingers like grains of sand. The weight of jealousy grew heavier with each passing day, until an idea, dark and unthinkable, took shape in his mind. The only way to reclaim his destiny was to remove the obstacle standing in his way. Kwame found himself walking towards the outskirts of the village, where the old herbalist Nana Boma lived. Rumors whispered that the old man knew remedies beyond mere herbs, potions that could cure and others that could destroy. Kwame hesitated before knocking on the wooden door, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Nana Boma, with his wrinkled face and eyes that seemed to pierce into one's soul, greeted him with a knowing nod, as if he had been expecting him all along. "I see darkness in your heart, Kwame," the old man muttered as he prepared a drink of bitter herbs. "Are you sure you wish to walk this path?" Kwame hesitated, but his longing for power drowned his conscience. "I seek a way to ensure my place as chief," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, Nana Boma handed him a small vial of a dark, viscous liquid. 3 drops, the old man warned. No more, no less. Kwame clenched the vial in his palm, unaware that he had just sealed his fate. The night of Kojo's celebratory feast arrived, a joyous occasion filled with laughter, drumming, and dancing. The entire village had gathered to honor their future chief, and Kwame, despite the storm inside him, wore a mask of happiness. He moved through the crowd, carrying a wooden cup filled with palm wine laced with the poison. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied himself as he approached Kojo, who greeted him with a warm smile and embraced him. "To our future, my brother," Kojo said, raising his cup in a toast. Kwame forced a grin and echoed his words before watching Kojo drink deeply. Minutes passed, then Kojo staggered slightly, gripping his chest. The joyous music faltered, and a hush fell over the crowd. Panic spread as Kojo collapsed, his breathing ragged. Kwame knelt beside him, playing the part of a grieving friend, but deep within, he felt a darkness take root. Kojo's eyes locked onto his for a fleeting moment. Was it suspicion or betrayal? Before they fluttered shut forever. The days following Kojo's death were steeped in sorrow. Women wept openly, and the elders walked with bowed heads, unable to comprehend how such a young, strong man could fall so suddenly. Kwame played his part well, standing by Kojo's grieving mother and offering comforting words. Yet, deep inside, the guilt festered, an unwelcome guest in his mind. He told himself it was necessary. Kojo had been in his way. Still, he could not ignore the way Kojo's mother looked at him, her eyes filled with silent suspicion. Soon, the elders made their decision. With no heir, the position of chief must pass to Kojo's closest confidant and brother in spirit, Kwame. The villagers celebrated again, but this time the music sounded hollow to Kwame. As he moved into Kojo's grand compound, a chill lingered in the air, and the wind howled through the empty corridors like a whisper from the past. Kwame stood before the elders as the village gathered in the courtyard of the chief's compound. The rhythmic drumming echoed through the evening air, signaling the moment of his coronation. Dressed in Kojo's ceremonial Kent cloth, Kwame felt the weight of the occasion pressing down on him like an unseen hand. He smiled and raised his staff, but beneath his outward confidence, guilt gnawed at him like termites burrowing into wood. As the crowd cheered, Kwame stepped into Kojo's grand home, the very place they had once dreamed of ruling together. The air inside felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were watching him. That night, alone in his new chambers, Kwame swore he could hear soft whispers drifting through the open windows. He told himself it was the wind, but deep in his heart, he knew the truth. Kojo was not gone. Not entirely. Kwame awoke in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, but the whisper was clear, like the rustling of leaves. Kwame. The voice carried through the silence, and he bolted upright, his eyes darting around the room. He called out, but no one answered. It had to be his mind playing tricks, he reasoned. The weight of his actions was simply bearing down on him. The next morning, he carried on with his duties, attending to disputes and trade matters, but the whisper lingered in his thoughts. Villagers came to him with their concerns, but he found himself distracted, his gaze drifting toward the empty seat that once belonged to Kojo. That night, as he lay in bed, the whisper returned, closer this time. You cannot hide, Kwame. His heart pounded as he pulled the covers over his head like a frightened child. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder. At first, Kwame dismissed them as a guilty conscience, but soon, the shadows began to move. Flickers at the edge of his vision, dark figures standing in corners, disappearing when he turned to look. His nights became sleepless, haunted by visions of Kojo standing at the foot of his bed, staring with lifeless eyes. The servants in the compound noticed their chief's weariness, the dark circles beneath his eyes, his sudden temper. Rumors began to spread. Kojo's spirit was not at rest, and the ancestors were displeased. Kwame grew paranoid, snapping at those closest to him, feeling the grip of guilt tighten around his throat. Every shadow became a reminder of his betrayal, and the once proud chief found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. One evening, as the village gathered in the square for a festival, the drums began to beat on their own. The rhythmic pounding echoed through the night, and the villagers fell silent, staring at the sacred drum, which no one had touched. Panic spread like wildfire, and whispers filled the air. Kojo's spirit had returned. Kwame stood frozen, his palms slick with sweat. His heart raced as the drum beats quickened, mirroring his own frantic pulse. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the drums fell silent. The elders exchanged worried glances, and Kwame knew the village was beginning to suspect what he had done. He fled to his chambers that night, but the drumming continued in his mind, a relentless reminder of his crime. Kojo's mother, Mame Afia, had been silent in her grief, but her eyes never left Kwame. She watched him closely, studying the way his shoulders tense whenever Kojo's name was mentioned, the way his gaze never quite met hers. She called upon the village priest, whispering her suspicions in hushed tones. Kwame could feel her eyes on him everywhere he went. Her quiet presence unsettled him more than the whispers in the night. One afternoon, she approached him directly, her voice steady but firm. "Kwame, my son's spirit is restless. What have you done?" The accusation hung between them like an unsaid curse. Kwame denied it, but in his heart, he felt the first cracks in his carefully built facade. The once fertile lands of Esumina began to wither under an unrelenting sun. Fields that had always flourished with golden maize and ripe yams now stood barren, their leaves curling and browning as if touched by an invisible hand. The villagers whispered among themselves, eyes drifting toward the chief's compound with suspicion. Some claimed it was a natural misfortune, but others believed it was a sign Kojo's spirit was angry, and the ancestors were withholding their blessings. Kwame stood in the fields, staring at the shriveled crops with a hollow gaze. "This is a test," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the weight of the whispers in the wind. He ordered the farmers to redouble their efforts, but no amount of labor could restore life to the dying land. Each night, as he lay awake in his grand compound, he swore he could hear Kojo's voice drifting through the fields, whispering his name with a sorrowful accusation. Sleep became a luxury Kwame could no longer afford. Each time he closed his eyes, he was dragged back to that fateful night, the feast, Kojo's laughter, the subtle flick of his wrist as he poured the poison. In his dreams, Kojo's eyes locked onto his, not with betrayal but with a quiet knowing. "You were my brother," the voice echoed through the dark recesses of his mind. His restless nights left him weary and distant. The village council noticed his erratic behavior, and the people whispered that their chief was no longer the man they had trusted. In his dreams, Kojo's image grew clearer, more persistent. One night, Kwame woke with a start, gasping for breath, only to find himself standing at the very spot where Kojo had collapsed during the feast, his feet covered in dust and sweat dripping from his brow. He no longer knew whether he was awake or trapped in his nightmares. Desperate for relief, Kwame sought out Nana Boma, the old herbalist who had given him the poison. The old man sat outside his hut, staring into the forest as if he had been expecting him. Without turning, he spoke in a low voice, "The spirits do not rest when justice is denied." Kwame clenched his fist. "I did what I had to do. Now the village suffers. How do I end this?" he asked, his voice laced with desperation. Nana Boma looked at him then, his eyes dark and heavy with something akin to pity. "You cannot escape the eyes of the ancestors. The only way to end the whispers is to face the truth." He handed Kwame a bundle of leaves, telling him they would bring clarity, but Kwame feared the kind of clarity they might bring. That night, a scream shattered the silence of the village. Kwame rushed to the courtyard of his compound, only to find his servants huddled in fear. Strange markings had appeared on the walls, symbols drawn in what looked like ash. They spiraled outward from Kojo's old sleeping quarters, forming intricate patterns that no one could understand. Kwame's hands trembled as he touched the markings, feeling an inexplicable cold radiating from them. The village elders arrived, studying the symbols with grave expressions. "The ancestors speak," one of them murmured. "This is a warning." Kwame, feeling the pressure of their stares, insisted it was a trick played by his enemies. But deep within, he knew the truth. Kojo's spirit was speaking, and it would not stop until justice was done. A young boy burst into the village square one afternoon, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw him," he cried, panting. "I saw Chief Kojo by the river." Gasps filled the air as villagers whispered among themselves, some nodding in solemn acceptance, others rushing to the riverbank in disbelief. Kwame's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the crowd. The boy pointed to the edge of the water, where footprints trailed into the dense forest. He was standing there, the boy whispered, watching us. Kwame swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. You've let your imagination run wild, child, he said, though his voice wavered. But as he turned away, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves with a sound that almost seemed like a whisper of his name. The village council called Kwame to a private meeting, their faces grim and lined with concern. Strange things have been happening, Kwame, said Elder Ose, his piercing eyes locked onto him. The land dies, the people are afraid, and now there are whispers of Kojo's return. Do you believe the ancestors are displeased? Kwame forced a smile. These are natural occurrences, Elder Ose. I assure you, I am doing all I can. But his words felt empty, even to himself. The council exchanged uneasy glances, and Kwame knew that doubt was taking root among them. For the first time, he realized that his power was slipping through his fingers like the sand of the dry riverbed. One evening, the village priest summoned the people to the shrine, his voice heavy with urgency. Kojo's spirit seeks justice, he proclaimed. The ancestors demand that the truth be revealed, or Esumina will suffer further misfortune. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Kwame. Kwame felt his chest tighten. What do you mean? He asked, his voice a whisper. The priest locked eyes with him. You must undergo the sacred trial of truth, or face the wrath of the ancestors. Panic clawed at him, there was no way out. He would have to confess, or risk the spirit's vengeance. The weight of his guilt had become unbearable. In the dead of night, Kwame stood before Kojo's mother in her hut, his hands trembling. Tears welled in his eyes as he knelt before her. I did it, he whispered, his voice cracking. I took his life. Mem Afia said nothing for a long moment, her gaze piercing through him like fire. The next morning, Kwame stood before the village, his voice trembling as he confessed his sin. Gasps of shock and cries of anger filled the air. The elders, their faces heavy with disappointment, conferred among themselves. You have betrayed us all, Elder Ose finally spoke. The ancestors will decide your fate. Kwame was stripped of his title and taken to the sacred grove, where the elders performed rituals to cleanse the village of his sins. Bound in shame, he awaited their verdict. Some called for exile, others for death. The spirits would have the final say. The wind howled through the trees, and a sudden calm fell over the gathering. The priest spoke, his voice steady. He will leave this land and never return. The ancestors have spoken. With his head bowed, Kwame walked away from the only home he had ever known, haunted by the whispers of his friend that would follow him for the rest of his days. Years passed, and the village of Esumina flourished once more under new leadership. Kwame, now a wandering man, sought redemption in distant lands, helping those in need and hoping to cleanse his soul. But every night, as he lay down to sleep beneath foreign skies, he still heard the wind whispering his name. Kojo's spirit had found justice, but Kwame's heart would never find peace. The past, like the wind, could never be escaped.